The morning of pride and pretense. Dr. Philip Grant strode purposefully through the entrance of Valley Hope Medical Center, his designer loafers clicking sharply against the polished marble floors. This hospital was his fortress, where he had meticulously crafted a career over 2 decades. Known for his remarkable skill in orthopedic surgery, his name was synonymous with precision and clinical detachment, a persona he had honed like the edge of a scalpel. He believed firmly in hierarchy and respect, with himself perched comfortably at the top. "Good morning, Dr. Grant," chirped Ms. Ellie, the middle-aged receptionist who had worked at the hospital nearly as long as he had. She beamed with the unfiltered enthusiasm that most patients found welcoming, though Dr. Grant himself merely found it trivial. "Morning, Ms. Ellie," he replied, offering only the slightest nod in her direction. He didn't like to waste time with pleasantries. To him, every second was a piece of the day he could allocate towards his professional success. As he approached the elevators, he noticed 2 interns whispering as they peeked at him from the corner of their eyes, clearly intimidated by his presence. He relished that reaction, seeing it as a well-earned respect. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the 5th floor. His floor, as he liked to remind others. The orthopedic unit bustled with activity, and the hushed conversations of nurses updating charts and the faint hum of medical equipment greeted him as he walked towards his office. His usual assistant, a junior doctor named Alan, scurried to keep up with his brisk pace. "Dr. Grant," Alan began nervously, holding a tablet with the day's schedule. "Just a reminder, you have the board review meeting after lunch. The committee wants your input on the upcoming budget cuts." Grant rolled his eyes slightly. He had little patience for administration work, but he couldn't deny the influence the board afforded him. "Of course, Alan. Anything urgent before then?" "Well, there was a call from the ER about an incoming case." Grant raised his hand, signaling for silence. "I'm not interested in every minor emergency that comes through. ER cases are rarely critical enough for my attention unless they've been properly triaged. I don't need distractions today, especially not from patients that don't contribute to this department's reputation." Ellen nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. He was well aware of Dr. Grant's tendency to dismiss patients based on a quick, cold calculation of worth. Once inside his office, Dr. Grant settled into the comfort of his ergonomic leather chair, allowing his gaze to wander over his wall of achievements. His medical degree from an Ivy League school, his numerous publications in prestigious journals, and awards lauding his contributions to the field. Each framed certificate gleamed under the soft lighting, a testament to his hard-earned reputation. However, his reverie was broken by a light knock at the door. It was Nurse Hamilton, her face pale and tight-lipped, a look that Grant recognized from her rare visits. She usually brought with her the kinds of cases she knew required swift, skilled intervention. "Dr. Grant, we have a woman in the ER," she began, her voice low but urgent. "She's in critical condition, but she has a complex history that might require specialized treatment." Grant sighed, barely concealing his irritation. "There are plenty of doctors in the ER, Hamilton. Surely one of them can take this case." Hamilton's lips twitched in frustration, but she kept her tone steady. "The patient appears to have multiple fractures, possibly old injuries that weren't healed properly. Her medical history is unusual. They thought you might want to at least review her file since orthopedics could play a crucial role in her treatment." He could feel his patience wearing thin. He had no interest in being dragged into the kind of cases ER typically handled, especially not for people who, in his estimation, rarely took responsibility for their health. Without glancing up, he replied, "Have one of the residents handle it. They need the experience." Hamilton hesitated, clearly weighing whether to press further. But years of dealing with his stern personality held her back, and with a stiff nod, she left the office. Moments later, the phone on his desk buzzed. It was Ellen again. "Sir, the ER has called again. They're insisting. The patient's injuries are extensive, and they say there might be complications. The on-call resident feels she needs a specialist immediately. Grant gritted his teeth. This was not how he planned to spend his morning. Tell them I'll look at her file in my own time, and they can make do until then, he replied curtly, ending the call before Alan could respond. He had no intention of rearranging his day for a patient he deemed unimportant. But as the minutes passed, something strange began to nag at him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. A restless, insistent thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't shake. The patient's case was beginning to pull at his curiosity, if only slightly. But even as he dismissed the thought, the persistent buzzing of his office phone once again disrupted his focus. Exasperated, he finally picked up. "What now?" he barked. "Dr. Grant, it's Nurse Hamilton again. I'm sorry to press, but this woman, she's declining rapidly. And she's asking for you specifically." Her words were, "Please, ask him to remember the promise he made." She wouldn't clarify further. A chill ran down his spine at the nurse's words. A promise. He couldn't recall ever making a promise to a patient, much less someone whose name he didn't even know. Yet something about the plea triggered an old buried memory. A time when he was just a resident himself, filled with idealism and a belief in saving lives, no matter the odds. "What's her name?" he asked finally, though he hadn't intended to. She gave her name as Maya. Maya Green. The name struck a faint, almost forgotten chord, but Dr. Grant couldn't quite place it. His mind ran through years of patients, the countless faces and names that had faded into his past. But Maya Green was different. As he stared blankly at the wall, his hand frozen on the phone receiver, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. After a prolonged silence, he spoke softly, almost reluctantly. "Very well, Nurse Hamilton. I'll go down and assess the situation personally. Let them know I'll be there shortly." Hanging up the phone, he sat back and exhaled, as if releasing a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. The encounter had stirred something strange in him, something uncomfortable. Dr. Philip Grant, a man known for his iron-willed control, felt a pang of guilt, though he would never admit it aloud. As he made his way to the ER, his steps were slower, his mind weighed down by a growing sense of unease. As he approached the ER doors, he squared his shoulders and took a deep breath, vanishing any lingering emotions from his face. He was a doctor, after all, a professional. But as he walked toward the curtained bay where Maya Green lay, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would be more than just another medical case. It would be a crossroads, one he was neither ready for nor could avoid. The woman behind the curtain. Dr. Philip Grant walked down the sterile white hallways of Valley Hope Medical Center toward the ER with an uncharacteristic heaviness in his chest. His fingers brushed the sides of his pristine lab coat, fidgeting in a way that betrayed his otherwise composed exterior. Despite his usual detachment, something about this particular case refused to fade from his mind. As he neared the emergency bay, the bustling sounds of nurses, doctors, and medical devices merged into a low, droning hum. A small crowd had formed just outside the bay, their faces marked with a mixture of worry and curiosity. Nurses murmured to one another as they glanced in his direction. As he approached, the conversations hushed, their eyes following him with a blend of relief and skepticism. Word had spread quickly that Dr. Grant had been specifically requested by the patient, though no one could understand why. It wasn't every day that a patient in critical condition would utter a doctor's name, especially when that doctor wasn't even assigned to them. Nurse Hamilton met him by the entrance, her face unreadable but her eyes unwavering. She handed him a clipboard with Maya's preliminary details, and he took it, scanning through the records with practiced efficiency. Maya Green, 36. Injuries included multiple fractures to her left femur, dislocated shoulder, and several old, untreated fractures evident on her x-rays. Additionally, the report noted extensive bruising along her ribs and arms, indicating a history of trauma. But it wasn't the injuries that unsettled him. It was the small, hastily written note at the bottom. Patient requested Dr. Philip Grant specifically. Recall the past promise made to her. Without a word, he handed the clipboard back to Hamilton and walked through the curtain. The woman lying in the hospital bed looked nothing like the patients he typically saw. Most of his patients arrived at his private practice with polished manners, well-dressed and well-spoken, seeking his expertise on elective surgeries or sports injuries. But Maya Green was different. Her dark skin was bruised and pale, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. Yet despite her frail state, there was an intensity in her gaze, a resilience that seemed to defy her weakened body. Maya's eyes fixed on him as he entered, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. She didn't smile. There was no sign of relief or gratitude, only a quiet resolve, as if she had expected him to be there all along. Dr. Grant felt an odd pang of discomfort as he approached her bedside. She didn't fit into any of the tidy categories he used to define his patients. She was an enigma, and he didn't like enigmas. He preferred order and predictability, where every patient was a case to be solved, every injury a puzzle to be mended. Maya Green, he began, his voice even and professional. I'm Dr. Philip Grant. You requested me. Maya nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Yes, I did. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness behind it that surprised him. He cleared his throat, feeling slightly unsettled by her direct gaze. I'm here to help, Ms. Green, but I don't understand how you know me. You mentioned a promise. A faint, weary smile tugged at the corners of her lips, though her expression remained guarded. It was a long time ago, Dr. Grant. I doubt you remember it. Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that made him pause. As he looked at her, flashes of memory began to surface, distant and blurred, like an old photograph fading at the edges. He struggled to piece them together, images of a younger man filled with ambition, yet still unburdened by the hardened cynicism that now defined him. Had he truly made a promise to this woman, or was it a figment of her imagination? I'm afraid I don't recall, Ms. Green, he said finally, the irritation creeping into his tone. But if there's something you wish to discuss, promise me, she interrupted softly, her voice almost a whisper, that you'll treat me as if I were any other patient. Treat me with the same care and attention you would give to someone who looks like you. The room seemed to grow colder, and Dr. Grant felt his mouth go dry. Her words were blunt, her tone unyielding, and the quiet accusation that lay beneath them pierced him in a way he hadn't expected. She was challenging him, stripping away his clinical detachment and forcing him to confront a part of himself he had carefully ignored. I don't discriminate in my practice, he replied stiffly, though even as he said it, a hollow feeling settled in his chest. He could sense the lie in his own words. Maya's eyes softened, though there was no hint of forgiveness there. I wasn't always this way, you know, she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. There was a time when I believed that doctors were healers, that they cared about people no matter who they were. But life has taught me that's not always true. Her words stung, but Dr. Grant kept his expression neutral, unwilling to let her see how deeply they affected him. He was the one in control here, the doctor, the authority. He wouldn't allow her to shake him. Maya, he said, addressing her by her first name now, I'm here to provide medical treatment, and I assure you that is exactly what I intend to do. Whatever past experiences you may have had, I am here to focus on your present condition. She seemed to study him, her gaze piercing through the thin veneer of professionalism he wore like armor. After a long, tense silence, she nodded, seemingly satisfied, though he couldn't tell if it was acceptance or resignation. Thank you, Dr. Grant, she said finally, her tone unreadable. I'll trust you for now, but don't make me regret it. The unspoken challenge lingered between them as he began his examination. As he pressed lightly along her ribcage to assess the extent of her injuries, he noticed the wince of pain that crossed her face. He worked with a careful precision, but the lingering doubt gnawed at him. Her bones felt fragile beneath his hands, her body marked with years of untreated injuries that hinted at a life of hardship. The thought bothered him. Why hadn't she received medical care sooner? How had she come to this point, so damaged and yet so strong? As he reviewed her x-rays, the extent of her injuries became even more apparent. The fractures in her femur and shoulder were severe, but the old, healed fractures on her ribs and spine hinted at years of enduring pain without proper care. And yet, through it all, she had managed to survive. The realization unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. This was a woman who had lived a life filled with pain, yet she had endured it with a quiet resilience. Finishing his examination, he turned back to Maya, his voice a bit softer than before. "You'll need surgery to repair the fractures in your leg and shoulder. It's a delicate procedure, but with proper treatment, you should make a full recovery." Maya met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "Thank you, Dr. Grant," she said quietly. "But this isn't just about recovery. It's about facing the truth, for both of us." He frowned, puzzled by her cryptic words, but chose not to press further. He had done his part, provided his professional assessment. Whatever emotional burden she carried was hers to bear, not his. Yet as he left the room and walked back toward his office, her words echoed in his mind. A promise, a truth, a test of his integrity. He had always prided himself on his professional success, his spotless reputation, but Maya Green had forced him to confront something deeper, something raw and uncomfortable. In the sterile silence of his office, surrounded by his trophies and accolades, he felt the weight of her gaze still upon him. Her strength, her resilience, and the quiet accusation in her eyes lingered in his thoughts, gnawing at the walls he had built around his heart. For the first time in years, Dr. Philip Grant felt as though his actions might have consequences beyond the confines of his carefully controlled world. And as he stared at the pristine certificates on his wall, he began to wonder if his life's work had truly been in service of others, or merely a monument to his own ego. The shadows of the past. After leaving Maya Green's hospital bay, Dr. Philip Grant returned to his office, hoping that the familiar surroundings would somehow shake off the disquiet that had settled over him. Yet, as he sat down, the feeling remained, an insistent, gnawing reminder of something he couldn't quite place. Her words echoed in his mind, each syllable pulling him further into the depths of a memory he'd long buried. Unable to concentrate, he reached into his desk drawer, pulling out an old leather-bound notebook. It was a relic from his residency years, filled with scribbled notes, patient names, and fragments of advice from mentors he had once respected. Flipping through its pages, he sought some link, some clue as to who Maya might be. But there was nothing, only endless notes on procedures, fragments of medical terminology, and sketches of skeletal structures. And yet, a part of him knew that Maya Green was more than just another patient. She was tied to a promise, one he hadn't remembered making, but which somehow held weight. As he sat there, lost in thought, a quiet knock at the door startled him. Alan, his assistant, entered, looking uneasy as he held a folder in his hands. "Dr. Grant, I thought you might want to see this," he said, hesitantly placing the folder on the desk. "It's a deeper history on Maya Green, pulled from the National Patient Database. Her case goes back further than we realized." Dr. Grant took the folder, a chill running down his spine as he opened it. Flipping through the records, he saw years of medical reports, each one chronicling a life of persistent suffering and hardship. Multiple hospital visits for fractured bones, bruising, untreated injuries, and other signs of physical abuse. Yet there were few follow-up notes, as if she had routinely left hospitals without proper care or had been discharged with minimal attention. One line, in particular, caught his attention, and his heart skipped a beat. It was from a clinic report dated 15 years ago, where a young intern doctor had noted Maya's case. The report bore his initials, PG, followed by a single, hastily written sentence. Promised patient a full recovery and necessary support. His own handwriting, neat and precise, stared back at him from the page. A flood of memories began to surge forth, Images of a young, eager Dr. Grant filled with ideals and a desire to help. He recalled the days of residency, a time when he had spent hours with patients, promising them hope and healing in his pursuit of purpose. But over the years, that ambition had been buried under layers of pride and professional detachment. He had climbed his way up, distancing himself from the emotional weight of medicine. And yet, here was a reminder of the very ideal he had once embraced, a promise he had made in earnest. In that moment, he remembered her. It had been a summer night in a crowded ER. He was just beginning his rotation, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of patients and the emotional toll that came with each case. Maya Green had been one of his first patients. She was young, perhaps barely 21, bruised and scared, brought in by a concerned neighbor who had noticed her limping down the street. She had confided in him about the abuse she'd endured, her voice a whisper as she spoke of the pain, the fear, the isolation. And he, filled with a zeal to heal, had promised her that he would be there for her, that he would help her escape the pain and rebuild her life. He had reassured her, perhaps even more than he should have, that she could rely on him. But then, life happened. The demands of his residency, the pursuit of professional accolades, the allure of advancement, all of it pulled him away. Over the years, he forgot Maya Green and countless others he'd made promises to in his early days. Sitting in his office, Dr. Grant felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had walked away, left her to navigate a dark, painful world alone, despite his promise. And now, 15 years later, she had come back into his life, carrying the scars he had ignored. His phone buzzed, jarring him from his thoughts. It was Nurse Hamilton. "Dr. Grant, I'm sorry to bother you, but Maya's vitals are deteriorating. She's asking for you again. She refuses to let anyone else treat her." Dr. Grant felt his throat tighten as the weight of his past choice pressed down on him. He knew he couldn't ignore her any longer, not this time. "I'll be right there," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. As he made his way to her room, a strange sense of urgency filled him, a drive he hadn't felt in years. It was as if each step was a chance to reclaim a piece of himself he had long abandoned. When he entered the room, Maya's eyes met his, weary but unwavering. She was weaker than before, her breathing labored, her skin pale beneath the bruises. But her gaze held the same determination, the same strength, as it had all those years ago. "I knew you'd come back," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Grant sat beside her, his once cold demeanor melting away as he took her hand in his, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath his fingers. "Maya, he began, struggling to find the words. "I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I should have kept my promise." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I didn't come here to make you feel guilty, Dr. Grant," she said gently. "I came here to remind you of who you were, of who you could still be. You once believed in healing people, not just their bodies, but their spirits." He felt the sting of her words, and it hit him that his journey as a doctor had taken him far from the ideals that had driven him. He had traded compassion for reputation, empathy for accolades. And in doing so, he had lost sight of his purpose. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed her hand gently. "You're right. Somewhere along the way, I lost that part of myself. But I want to make it right." Maya's eyes gleamed, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her. "Then do it. Not just for me, but for everyone you treat. People don't need perfection, Dr. Grant. They need humanity. They need someone who sees them." He nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of conviction he hadn't felt in years. "I promise you, Maya. This time, I'll keep my promise." But as he said the words, a faint alarm began to beep from the monitors surrounding her bed. Maya's breathing had grown shallow, her heart rate slowing. Nurses rushed into the room, their faces tense with worry as they prepared for emergency intervention. Dr. Grant's mind raced as he directed them, his voice steadied, but his heart pounding. He worked swiftly, following procedure, yet there was a desperation behind his actions, a determination to keep her alive, to save her not just as a doctor, but as the man he had once been. For what felt like hours, he fought to stabilize her, the tension in the room mounting with each passing second. Finally, the monitors steadied, her vitals returning to a fragile normal. The nurses exhaled, exchanging relief glances before stepping back to give her space. Dr. Grant stayed by her side, watching as she took shallow breaths, her eyes fluttering open once more. She looked at him, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He returned the smile, though his chest felt heavy with emotion. "This is just the beginning, Maya. I'll be here every step of the way." She nodded, her gaze softening. "I believe you." And in that moment, Dr. Grant felt as if a weight had been lifted from him, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. Maya's resilience, her ability to forgive and believe in him once more, had given him a second chance to reclaim the integrity he had lost. As he left her room, he knew that he would do everything in his power to ensure her recovery. But more than that, he knew that her words would stay with him, guiding him as he walked the path he had once abandoned. Yet as he walked back toward his office, a quiet voice within him warned that this journey was far from over. The consequences of his past choices were only beginning to unfold, and karma had a way of demanding its due. But for now, he would face it, one step at a time, determined to make things right, not just for Maya, but for himself, and for every patient he would treat in the future. The mirror of consequences. Dr. Philip Grant left Maya's hospital room with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. His interactions with her had left him shaken, forcing him to see himself in a way he had long avoided. Her courage and quiet strength had reawakened something within him, something he believed was buried beneath years of ambition and pride. He had promised her he'd be there, that he'd help her recover, and this time, he intended to keep that promise. Back in his office, Dr. Grant closed his door and leaned against it, breathing deeply. He took in his surroundings, the gleaming medical diplomas, the shelves stacked with prestigious journals, and the polished awards encased behind glass. These symbols of his success now felt hollow, mere trophies of a man he didn't entirely recognize anymore. Just then, his phone buzzed. Alan's voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Grant, the hospital board is waiting for you in the conference room. They've been discussing the upcoming budget, and they'd like your input on prioritizing funding for the orthopedic unit." Dr. Grant sighed. He'd forgotten about the meeting, though such discussions had once been his favorite part of the job. He had often taken pride in swaying decisions in favor of his department, using his influence to carve out larger budgets and secure more advanced equipment. But as he walked down the hall, he found himself questioning his motives. Was this truly about improving patient care, or had he been so blinded by his ambition that he put his department's prestige before its purpose? He entered the conference room, and the board members greeted him with smiles and handshakes, seemingly eager to hear his thoughts. The head of the board, Mr. Wilkins, an elderly man with sharp eyes and an impressive mane of silver hair, motioned for Dr. Grant to take a seat. "Dr. Grant, we appreciate your joining us," Mr. Wilkins began. "As you know, we're looking to make some budget adjustments. The orthopedic unit has done remarkably well this year under your leadership, and we're considering allocating additional funds to your department for new equipment and training programs." Dr. Grant nodded, his mind already racing with the potential benefits. He had always believed in the value of a state-of-the-art orthopedic unit, and this funding could elevate their capabilities further. However, Mr. Wilkins continued, adjusting his glasses, "We're also considering reallocation to expand services in the emergency room. The ER has been overwhelmed recently, especially with patients coming from underserved areas who require more immediate care. Our resources are stretched, and there's been a rise in critical cases that lack proper follow-up treatment." At the mention of underserved areas and lack of follow-up treatment, Dr. Grant felt a pang of guilt. Images of Maya flashed in his mind, the bruises, the untreated fractures, the pain she had silently carried. Her circumstances were likely the result of such overlooked needs, and it dawned on him that the very people he had ignored in his practice were the ones most in need of care. His focus on building a prestigious department had, in a way, contributed to the systemic neglect that had affected people like Maya. Dr. Grant, Mr. Wilkins prompted, interrupting his thoughts. We're eager to hear your perspective. Dr. Grant took a deep breath. I understand the need for resources in orthopedics, he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. But if I'm being honest, I believe the ER should be a priority this time. We often see patients arrive in orthopedics with untreated injuries that began as ER cases. If we could improve their initial treatment and ensure better follow-up care, it would ultimately benefit not just them but all departments. A murmur of surprise spread across the room. This was uncharacteristic of him. Dr. Grant was known for fiercely defending his department, often with little regard for others. But now, with Maya's story weighing on him, he saw things differently. Mr. Wilkins raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. That's a bold suggestion, Dr. Grant, and I appreciate your candor. Allocating to the ER would indeed require sacrifices from other departments. Are you sure this is the best decision for orthopedics? Yes, I am, Dr. Grant replied firmly, surprising even himself. In the long term, ensuring patients receive proper care in the ER could lessen the burden on orthopedics, and it's the right thing to do. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully, while others seemed uncertain. Dr. Grant's decision had undoubtedly shifted the direction of the meeting, and as he left the room, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He had sacrificed his department's growth, yet for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his own ambitions. After the meeting, he returned to Maya's room to check on her, hoping to share a small piece of good news with her, that her influence had already begun to change him. But as he approached her door, he was stopped by Nurse Hamilton, who wore a troubled expression. Dr. Grant, I'm glad you're here. Maya's condition has taken a sudden turn. She developed a high fever, and her vitals are unstable. He felt his heart drop. Just when he had begun to feel the weight of redemption, the possibility of losing her felt unbearable. Entering the room, he found Maya barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her skin flushed with fever. She looked weaker than before, her eyes fluttering open as he approached. He could feel his chest tighten as he watched her struggle. Dr. Grant, she whispered, her voice frail. I'm here, Maya, he replied softly, kneeling beside her bed. I won't leave. I promised you that. Maya's gaze held his, a faint smile playing on her lips despite the pain. Thank you for everything. He took her hand, feeling the fragile warmth of her skin. The thought of losing her, of failing her again, filled him with a desperation he hadn't expected. In that moment, she wasn't just a patient. She was a symbol of everything he had ignored, everything he had lost sight of. Nurse, prepare her for surgery, he ordered, standing abruptly. We can't wait any longer. Her injuries are compromising her health, and if we don't intervene now, it may be too late. The medical team sprang into action, prepping Maya for the emergency surgery. Dr. Grant scrubbed in, his mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. This surgery would be complicated, and her weakened condition added even more risk. Yet he knew that he couldn't let her down. As he began the procedure, his hands moved with precision, but his mind was clouded by a strange sense of urgency, of purpose that was greater than the surgery itself. He was fighting not just for her life, but for the chance to prove to himself that he could be the man he once aspired to be. Each incision, each movement of his instruments, felt like a step toward redemption. Hours passed as he worked tirelessly, the operation stretching late into the night. His team moved in silent coordination around him, understanding the gravity of the situation without a word. Dr. Grant could feel the weight of their trust, their belief in his skill, and he used it to fuel his resolve. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he completed the final suture and stepped back, exhaling deeply. The procedure had been a success, But Maya's recovery would be slow, her body needing time to heal fully. He watched her, still unconscious, her breathing steady but faint, and he felt a profound sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. The next morning, as Dr. Grant sat by her bed, she began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and awe. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. "You saved me too, Maya. More than you know." They shared a quiet moment, their gazes locked, each understanding the transformation they had ignited in one another. For Dr. Grant, this was no longer just about treating a patient. It was about reclaiming his humanity, his compassion, and the part of him he had left behind. But just as he felt the beginnings of hope, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. It was from the hospital administration. There had been complaints filed by a few of his patients' families, questioning his recent shift in focus and the apparent delay in their treatments. Rumors had started to spread that Dr. Grant's priorities had shifted, that he was no longer the celebrity surgeon they had come to expect. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His renewed focus on patient care, on helping those like Maya, was coming at a cost. His reputation, carefully constructed over years, was beginning to falter. He was being forced to choose: continue on this path of redemption, or return to the safe, detached prestige he had once cherished. As he turned back to Maya, he realized that his journey was only beginning, that karma had yet to fully unfold. He was now at a crossroads, facing a choice that would define the rest of his life, and for the first time, he felt prepared to face whatever consequences lay ahead, knowing that Maya's presence had given him the courage to truly live up to the promise he had made. The echoes of redemption. After the intense surgery that stretched into the early morning hours, Dr. Philip Grant slumped against the wall outside Maya's room, feeling the heavy toll of exhaustion. His mind raced with a mix of satisfaction and dread, replaying each precise movement he'd made during the operation. He had delivered on his promise to her, giving her body a fighting chance to heal. But the lingering weight of something more profound gnawed at him, warning that this journey was far from over. Maya's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't just about recovery. It's about facing the truth, for both of us." She had seen him, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in his life, and her strength had stripped away his carefully constructed defenses, forcing him to confront the man he had become. He returned to his office, his white coat now stained from the long hours of surgery. As he walked through the corridors, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, some curious, others uncertain. His decision to prioritize Maya's care over other high-profile cases had caused a stir among the staff. Word traveled fast in a hospital, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Dr. Grant's reputation as a brilliant, unyielding surgeon was in question, and for the first time in his career, he found himself facing the subtle but palpable divide. Settling into his office, he closed the door, hoping for a brief respite. But the silence was soon broken by a sharp knock. He turned to see Dr. Rachel Kim, one of his most trusted colleagues and a respected voice in the hospital, standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Phil, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She crossed her arms, her piercing gaze fixed on him. "The board has been talking, and I'm hearing complaints from patients' families. They're starting to question your priorities." Dr. Grant sighed, rubbing his temples. "Rachel, I know there's been some concern, but Maya needed my help. Her condition was critical, and it demanded my full attention." Rachel's eyes softened, though her stance remained firm. "I understand that, but you've always prided yourself on handling multiple cases, balancing your patients with precision. This sudden focus on one patient, especially one without financial resources or connections, it's not like you, and people are noticing." He looked at her, his frustration building. "Maybe it should have been like me all along, Rachel. Maybe I've been wrong, and this is the way I should have been practicing from the start." Rachel studied him, her expression softening as a hint of understanding crept into her eyes. "Is this about the past, Phil? About the promises you made when you were a young, idealistic intern?" He stiffened, surprised by how accurately she'd seen through him. "I don't know if you'd call it idealism, Rachel. It's more like I've spent years focused on things that don't truly matter. Status, accolades, fame. And in the process, I forgot why I became a doctor in the first place." Maya reminded me of that. Rachel nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "I can see you've changed, Phil. And I respect that. But this shift, it's going to come at a cost. The board expects results, and your patients expect the level of attention you've given them over the years. If you keep prioritizing cases like Maya's, you're putting yourself in a precarious position." Dr. Grant leaned back in his chair, a grim determination settling over him. "Then so be it. I'm willing to face those consequences. This is who I need to be." A silence settled between them. Rachel's eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. She placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Just be careful, Phil. You're treading a fine line, and I don't want to see you lose everything you've built." With that, she left, leaving him alone in his office once more. He sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she was right. His shift in focus was beginning to ripple through the hospital, affecting his relationships, his reputation, and his position. But for the first time, he felt at peace with the path he was taking, regardless of the consequences. Just then, his phone buzzed, a notification from his hospital email. Opening it, he found a message from the administration, titled, "Immediate Inquiry into Dr. Grant's Recent Decisions." The email detailed complaints from two high-profile patients' families, both of whom were displeased with the delay in their care. The administration had scheduled a review, noting that Dr. Grant's recent actions would be evaluated for potential professional negligence. He felt a sinking sensation in his chest. The complaints were more than mere dissatisfaction. They were an official inquiry, a sign that his career was on the line. The board would scrutinize his choices, questioning whether his shift in priorities was ethical, whether he had failed his duty as a surgeon. And as he read the email, the gravity of his decision settled over him like a dark cloud. In the following days, Dr. Grant's life at the hospital became increasingly challenging. The nurses and junior doctors seemed divided, some quietly supportive, inspired by his newfound compassion, while others grew cautious, keeping their distance as if his change in behavior made him unpredictable. Rumors swirled, and his patients began to show signs of doubt, sensing the subtle but growing tension around him. Meanwhile, Maya's condition remained fragile. Though her surgery had been a success, she faced a long road to recovery, and her immune system was weakened from years of neglect. Dr. Grant visited her daily, monitoring her progress and speaking with her in quiet moments, sharing stories of his journey as a doctor. Maya listened with a calm resilience, her presence a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. One evening, as he sat beside her, she looked at him, her eyes clear and intent. "I know they're giving you trouble because of me," she said softly. "You don't have to keep doing this, Dr. Grant. You don't owe me anything." He shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's not about owing, Maya. You reminded me of the promises I made when I was young. Promises I broke. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." She reached out, her hand weak but steady as she placed it over his. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never thought I'd find someone who cared enough to keep fighting. You've already done more than I ever expected." As he held her hand, a fierce determination welled up within him. He had already come this far, risked everything, and he wasn't about to turn back now. But the hospital administration's scrutiny intensified. The board scheduled a formal review, and he was summoned to present his case, defend his choices. He knew that his future depended on his ability to convince them that his shift in priorities was not a matter of negligence but of principle. The review day arrived, and Dr. Grant sat across from the board members, each of their expressions stern and assessing. Mr. Wilkins, the head of the board, cleared his throat, his voice cold and precise. "Dr. Grant, you've been one of our most esteemed surgeons for years. Your skill and reputation have brought this hospital a great deal of respect. But recent actions have raised concerns. We have complaints from patients who feel neglected, families who expected more. We need to understand, what exactly are you trying to achieve?" Dr. Grant took a deep breath, meeting each of their gazes with unwavering resolve. "I came into this field to heal, to help those who need it most. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I became focused on accolades, on recognition. But I've realized that medicine isn't about prestige, it's about compassion. Maya Green's case reminded me of that." Mr. Wilkins frowned. "Are you saying that other patients, those who can afford your expertise, are less deserving of your attention?" "No," Dr. Grant replied firmly. "Every patient deserves the best care, but for too long, I prioritized those who could offer something in return. Maya came to me in desperation, needing someone who would care for her regardless of status or wealth. And I realized that I had lost that part of myself, the part that believed in true, compassionate care." A silence filled the room as the board members exchanged glances, each grappling with his words. Finally, Mr. Wilkins sighed, his expression softening. "You're a skilled surgeon, Dr. Grant, but you're also part of a system that requires balance, professionalism, and above all, consistency. If you're determined to continue down this path, you should be prepared for the consequences." Dr. Grant nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I am, whatever those consequences may be." In the weeks that followed, the hospital placed restrictions on his cases, funneling high-profile patients to other surgeons and allocating a smaller portion of funds to his department. His influence waned, his prestige dimmed, yet he found himself strangely content. Each day he worked with Maya, monitoring her recovery, offering her the care and attention he had once reserved for only the wealthiest patients. As her strength returned, she became a symbol to him, a reminder of why he had chosen this path, of the promise he had once made to heal without prejudice, to serve without expectation. And though his journey was far from over, Dr. Grant knew he was on the right path. Maya's courage and resilience had reignited the fire he'd thought was lost, guiding him back to the man he had once aspired to be. He had chosen to walk this road, to face the echoes of his past and the challenges of his present, knowing that redemption was not a destination but a journey, one he was finally ready to take, step by unwavering step. Trials of the heart. In the days following Dr. Philip Grant's decision to openly advocate for patient-centered care, the hospital's atmosphere shifted in ways that were both subtle and seismic. For years, he had walked these halls as an untouchable figure, his reputation towering above others as a symbol of clinical precision and surgical brilliance. Now he found himself on unfamiliar ground, a man stripped of his status, respected by some but regarded with suspicion by many more. The weight of his choices began to press down on him, both professionally and personally. The hospital board's decision to limit his caseload was only the beginning. Rumors spread among his patients, fueled by families and colleagues whispering about his change in focus and alleged neglect of high-profile cases. Patients he had treated for years began requesting transfers, uneasy about his sudden shift toward serving the hospital's marginalized populations. Where once he had reveled in the admiration of both his peers and patients, Dr. Grant now found himself alienated, seen as a man whose new priorities disrupted the established order. Through it all, however, one constant remained: Maya Green. Despite her fragile state, she continued to show remarkable resilience, and each day he spent with her reminded him why he had chosen this path. Her courage was contagious, a quiet strength that defied the suffering she had endured, and her steady recovery became the beacon he needed. He often found himself confiding in her, revealing glimpses of his inner struggles and fears, knowing she would understand in ways no one else could. One evening, As the last rays of sunlight filtered through her hospital room window, casting a warm glow on her healing face, Maya looked at him with a depth of understanding that seemed to reach his very core. "You're still struggling," she said softly, her voice filled with empathy. Dr. Grant nodded, unable to mask his weariness. "I am. This path I've chosen. It feels right, but it's as if I'm fighting an entire system. The administration, my colleagues, even some of my patients, they don't understand why I'm doing this. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "True change is never easy, Dr. Grant. It threatens people's sense of stability, their belief that the way things are is the way they should always be. But you've reminded me that there are still people willing to fight for what's right. Even if it costs you everything, isn't that worth something?" Her words struck him deeply, stirring a resolve that had flickered dangerously close to extinguishing. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for her or for his patients. He was fighting for himself, for the ideals he had once abandoned, and was now determined to reclaim. But his journey wasn't just one of idealistic redemption. The system he had once supported was now actively resisting his efforts. That same week, Dr. Grant received a formal notice from the hospital board, informing him of a disciplinary hearing regarding the misallocation of resources and disregard for departmental priorities. They had cited patient complaints and his recent shift in focus, questioning his fitness to continue leading the orthopedic unit. The hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon, a day that felt ominous as it loomed closer. Dr. Grant prepared himself, knowing he would have to confront his former colleagues, defend his choices, and somehow prove that his actions were not reckless but necessary. The morning of the hearing, he visited Maya's room one last time, needing the quiet strength her presence always provided. She was sitting up in bed, her complexion healthier, though her movements were still tentative. She smiled as he entered, sensing his tension. "You're facing them today, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, and it may be the last time I stand in front of them as head of orthopedics." Maya reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Remember who you are, Dr. Grant. You're not just a doctor. They may have forgotten, but I know you haven't. You're someone who chose to stand up for people like me when no one else would." He felt the words settle within him, bolstering his resolve. With a final nod, he left her room, heading to the boardroom where his fate would be decided. As he entered, he found the board members waiting, their faces stern and unreadable. Mr. Wilkins, the head of the board, sat at the center of the long table, flanked by Dr. Rachel Kim and several other high-ranking administrators. The atmosphere was tense, and Dr. Grant knew that every word he said would be scrutinized. Mr. Wilkins began, his tone clipped. "Dr. Grant, we've convened this hearing to address a growing concern among our staff and patients. In recent weeks, it has become evident that your focus has shifted significantly, prioritizing cases that, while deserving of care, do not align with the high standards we expect from your department." Dr. Grant met his gaze, his own voice calm but firm. "Mr. Wilkins, I understand your concerns, but I believe that high standards should apply to all patients, not just those who can afford advanced treatments or bring prestige to the hospital. Medicine should be about healing, not profit." A murmur rippled through the room, but Mr. Wilkins remained unmoved. "While that may be true in an ideal world, this hospital operates within certain parameters, Dr. Grant. Resources are limited, and we rely on high-profile cases to support our financial stability. Your recent decisions have jeopardized our reputation, and complaints from patients suggest that your methods are, frankly, unsustainable." Dr. Grant took a deep breath, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I understand that the hospital requires financial support, but we can't sacrifice the very purpose of our profession in pursuit of stability. There are patients who have fallen through the cracks, who come here as a last hope. Maya Green is one of those patients, and her story represents countless others who deserve our care." Dr. Rachel Kim spoke next, her voice gentler, but no less probing. "Phil, I respect your dedication, But the question isn't whether these patients deserve care. It's whether you can balance your responsibilities to all patients. You've been our top surgeon for years, and your skills are needed across the board. Can you commit to serving both high-profile cases and patients like Maya, without letting personal motivations cloud your judgment? He met her gaze, feeling the full weight of her words. I believe I can, Dr. Kim. And I also believe that by caring for patients like Maya, I am serving all patients. A healthcare system that neglects the most vulnerable eventually fails everyone. We can create a department that supports all patients without compromising our mission. Silence fell over the room, and for a moment, Dr. Grant wondered if his words had resonated or merely confirmed their suspicions. But Mr. Wilkins' expression remained impassive. Dr. Grant, your commitment is admirable, he said finally, his tone icy. But we cannot operate on ideals alone. Effective immediately, we are placing you on a probationary period, during which your department's activities will be closely monitored. You are expected to prioritize cases in accordance with hospital policy. Failure to comply will result in immediate dismissal. The decision was a blow, but Dr. Grant met it with unwavering resolve. I understand. I'll comply with the guidelines, but I won't abandon my commitment to treating every patient with the same care and dedication. The board adjourned, leaving Dr. Grant alone in the echoing silence of the boardroom. He sat for a moment, absorbing the impact of the decision. His role, his influence, and his autonomy as head of orthopedics had been diminished. But he knew that the true battle wasn't about titles or power. It was about integrity. And he had chosen the harder path, one that demanded sacrifice and resilience. When he returned to Maya's room, she was sitting up, her face brightening as he entered. She seemed to sense the shift in him, the quiet strength he had reclaimed. How did it go? She asked, her voice gentle but expectant. He managed a small smile, shrugging slightly. I'm on probation. They don't trust my decisions, and I'm under close scrutiny. But I told them I wouldn't abandon this path, no matter what. Maya's eyes shone with pride. You chose the hard way, didn't you? He chuckled softly, nodding. I guess I did, but it's the only way that feels right. Over the coming weeks, Dr. Grant adapted to his new limitations, facing the increased oversight with quiet determination. He focused on his patients, finding ways to balance the demands of his position while continuing to offer compassionate care to those who needed it most. Despite the constraints, he discovered a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, knowing he was finally staying true to his purpose. Maya continued to recover, her strength growing with each day, and she became a source of inspiration not only for him, but for others in the hospital. Her resilience, her quiet courage, and her gratitude touched the lives of nurses, doctors, and patients alike, reminding them all of the healing power of compassion. One evening, as he sat with her, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. You've given me so much, Dr. Grant, more than I ever thought possible. But I think it's time I found my own way again. You've shown me that I'm worth fighting for, and that's a gift I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. He felt a pang of bittersweet pride, knowing she was ready to leave the hospital, to reclaim her independence. You fought for yourself, Maya, he replied softly. I may have helped, but the strength was always yours. As she prepared to leave, Dr. Grant stood by her side, feeling a sense of profound gratitude and respect. She had changed him, reigniting a part of him he thought he'd lost forever. And as she walked out of the hospital doors, a quiet sense of fulfillment washed over him, a feeling that he had finally become the doctor, the man he was always meant to be. But his journey was not over. The battles ahead were sure to be challenging, but he knew that as long as he held on to the courage, compassion, and integrity that Maya had helped him rediscover, he would continue to walk the path of true healing, no matter the cost. The legacy of compassion. Dr. Philip Grant watched from his office window as Maya Green left Valley Hope Medical Center, her steady steps a testament to her resilience. She was walking toward a new chapter, one that she had earned through years of quiet endurance and the resolve to heal despite everything life had thrown at her. He felt a swell of pride, knowing that he had played a part in her recovery. Yet, as he watched her disappear into the distance, a sense of finality settled over him, as if he were saying goodbye to more than just a patient. Maya had become a symbol of the promise he had made to himself, a commitment to compassion and integrity, even in the face of hardship. The probationary period imposed by the hospital administration weighed on him heavily. Every case he took, every decision he made, was scrutinized closely. Each day brought new challenges as he struggled to balance his desire to treat every patient with dignity against the hospital's relentless focus on profit and prestige. He had sacrificed his reputation and status, and there were moments when the weight of his choice felt almost unbearable. One afternoon, as he was reviewing patient charts, Alan, his assistant, appeared at his door with a troubled expression. "Dr. Grant, there's someone here to see you. He's from the state medical board. It seems serious," Alan said, his voice laced with concern. Dr. Grant's heart sank. He had expected resistance from the hospital administration, but a visit from the state medical board was something else entirely. This was not just about internal politics. This could affect his license, his ability to practice, and the career he had dedicated his life to. He rose slowly, steeling himself as he prepared to face yet another battle. The representative from the medical board, a tall, imposing man with a serious expression, stood waiting for him in the conference room. "Dr. Grant, I'm here to discuss recent concerns that have been raised regarding your conduct and the standards of care in your department," the representative began, his voice firm but even. "We've received complaints from both the hospital administration and certain patient families. They allege that your recent focus on lower-profile cases has come at the expense of your other responsibilities." Dr. Grant took a deep breath, meeting the representative's gaze steadily. "I understand the concerns, but I believe that all patients deserve the same level of care, regardless of their financial or social status. Medicine should be about healing, not profit." The representative studied him thoughtfully. "Dr. Grant, no one is questioning your intentions, but your actions have disrupted a delicate balance within the hospital. If every doctor followed this approach without regard for the system's constraints, the entire structure could be compromised." The words stung, but Dr. Grant held his ground. "If the structure only serves a select few, then perhaps it's time we question its integrity. I can't continue to be part of a system that values profit over compassion." The representative's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained cautious. "Dr. Grant, I understand your position, and I respect your dedication. However, the medical board requires evidence that your choices benefit all patients. If your department can demonstrate sustainable improvements in patient outcomes without compromising high-profile cases, the board might consider your methods. But until then, any deviation from hospital policy will be subject to formal review." Dr. Grant nodded, though he felt a mix of relief and frustration. He had bought himself time, but the stakes had risen. If he wanted to prove that compassion-driven care could coexist with the hospital's demands, he would need to show measurable success under increasingly difficult conditions. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Grant threw himself into his work, determined to create a model for patient care that prioritized compassion without compromising the hospital's standards. He began by implementing a mentorship program within his department, training younger doctors to treat each patient as an individual, focusing on holistic recovery plans rather than merely fixing isolated injuries. He introduced interdisciplinary case reviews, bringing together specialists from various fields to address complex cases with a team-oriented approach. Some of his colleagues were skeptical, but a few, including Dr. Rachel Kim, saw the potential in his methods. Rachel became a valuable ally, working closely with Dr. Grant to refine his approach and provide the necessary documentation for the medical board. Together, they focused on data-driven improvements, tracking patient outcomes and satisfaction scores to demonstrate the effectiveness of his new methods. However, as his methods gained traction, resistance from hospital administration intensified. Budget cuts, resource limitations, and a subtle campaign of discrediting his work became daily obstacles. His former allies within the administration now treated him with disdain, viewing his compassion-driven model as a threat to the hospital's financial stability. One evening, as he was reviewing patient reports, Alan appeared at his door, his face pale. "Dr. Grant, there's been an incident. The administration is saying they're holding you responsible." Dr. Grant's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" Alan swallowed, looking uneasy. "One of your high-profile patients, a professional athlete you operated on last month, developed post-operative complications. His family is accusing you of neglect, claiming you were distracted by other patients." Dr. Grant felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He remembered the case well, a complex, neat reconstruction that had gone smoothly, or so he thought. He had followed every protocol, checked on the patient personally, and ensured a smooth recovery plan. But now, the patient's family was threatening to sue, citing lack of attention as the reason for his complications. The news spread quickly, and the administration seized the opportunity to amplify their criticisms of his methods. Meetings were called, inquiries initiated, and soon, Dr. Grant found himself facing not only internal scrutiny, but also the very real threat of a lawsuit. His entire career, his license, and his reputation were now in jeopardy. In the midst of this crisis, Dr. Rachel Kim sought him out, her face filled with determination. "Phil, this is unfair. They're using this incident to discredit everything you've worked for. But I believe in what you're doing, and I'm not the only one. If you're willing, I think we can turn this around." Dr. Grant looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I'm willing, Rachel. But how? The administration is against me, and the board won't consider my methods until I can show them quantifiable success." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "Then we focus on the patients who have benefited from your methods. We gather testimonials, track long-term outcomes, and present a case that shows the real impact of compassionate care." With Rachel's help, Dr. Grant began reaching out to patients who had experienced positive transformations through his new approach. Many of these patients, including those from underserved backgrounds, shared stories of how his care had changed their lives. Maya Green, who had fully recovered and found steady work, became one of his most vocal advocates, her testimony highlighting the profound impact his compassion had on her journey. As Dr. Grant and Rachel compiled the testimonials and data, the hospital administration grew increasingly uneasy. The medical board took notice, calling for a special hearing to review Dr. Grant's case, allowing him the chance to defend his methods and present his evidence. On the day of the hearing, Dr. Grant entered the boardroom, his nerves tempered by a quiet confidence. Maya and several of his former patients sat in the gallery, their presence a reminder of the lives he had touched. Rachel sat beside him, her support unwavering. Mr. Wilkins, head of the hospital board, opened the proceedings, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Grant, you've been granted this hearing to address the concerns raised by the administration. However, we understand you've prepared evidence to support your approach to patient care. Please proceed." Dr. Grant began by outlining his philosophy, emphasizing the need for holistic, compassionate treatment and the tangible benefits it had brought to his patients. He presented data showing improved recovery times, decreased readmission rates, and enhanced patient satisfaction. Rachel followed with her own findings, supporting his approach with compelling statistics that demonstrated the long-term benefits of his methods. Finally, Maya took the stand, her voice steady as she shared her story of survival and redemption. She spoke of the suffering she endured before Dr. Grant's care, the way his compassion had restored her sense of worth, and the strength he had helped her find. Her words held a raw authenticity that no amount of data could convey. And as she finished, a hushed silence fell over the room. The board members exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully. After a long pause, Mr. Wilkins cleared his throat. "Dr. Grant, the board acknowledges the depth and dedication of your work. While your methods may have disrupted the hospital's status quo, The evidence you've presented suggests that compassionate care, when applied with balance and professionalism, can indeed benefit all patients. Therefore, we are prepared to reinstate your position, with the understanding that your department will serve as a model for integrating compassionate care within our hospital's framework. Dr. Grant felt a surge of relief, his heart swelling with gratitude. He looked at Rachel, who offered him a proud smile, and at Maya, who nodded, her eyes filled with quiet pride. As he left the hearing, his mind buzzed with new ideas, visions of a hospital that could balance compassion and professionalism, a place where all patients were seen as worthy of care, regardless of their status. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but he felt ready, prepared to face whatever lay ahead with the strength and integrity he had found through Maya. In the days that followed, Dr. Grant embraced his role with renewed purpose. His department flourished, becoming a beacon of compassionate care, attracting talented doctors who shared his vision. And though the journey had cost him dearly, he knew he had gained something far more valuable, a legacy built not on accolades, but on the lives he had touched, the promises he had kept, and the profound realization that true healing went beyond the physical. And as he walked through the halls of Valley Hope Medical Center, he felt a quiet peace, knowing he was finally the doctor and the man he had always aspired to be.